I'm Dennis Edwards, Associate Professor of New Testament at North Park Theological Seminary. Welcome to the 35th Annual Symposium on Theological Interpretation of Scripture. We're really glad you could attend this event the first time it's fully online. Now, if you were to go to northpark.edu/seminary, it would not take you long to find an archive containing recordings of past symposia. You could also explore the website of Wipf&Stock, WIF, W-I-P-F, and Stock, S-T-O-C-K. They publish the Ex-Auditu journal, Auditu, A-U-D-I-T-U. That journal is where you'll see the final versions of all presenter and respondent papers. Last year's symposium was canceled due to uncertainties regarding the pandemic. The scheduled topic was politics, and we imagined how stimulating it would have been to have a discussion less than 2 months before the presidential election. But we think having a discussion after the election is still quite interesting, so we kept the same topic. In the past, when we have gathered in person, we participated in a public worship service in the seminary chapel. Well, right now, I want to follow the practice of my Quaker friends and invite you to join me in a moment of silent worship as we prepare for a stimulating discussion. Let's just take a moment. Amen. Please know we are eager to hear your questions and comments after each presentation, but you will need to type those comments and questions in this online format. Our first 30-minute presentation is from Dr. Stephen Chapman. He is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Duke Divinity School and an ordained American Baptist minister. Immediately after Dr. Chapman, there will be a brief response from Dr. Michelle Clifton-Soderstrom, who is the Dean of Faculty and Professor of Theology and Ethics at North Park Theological Seminary and ordained in the Evangelical Covenant Church. After these presentations, there'll be about 30 minutes for your comments and questions. Dr. Chapman.
Thanks so much. I am really glad to be a part of this initiative this year. I've been able to participate in a couple of the North Park conferences in the past, and I've really enjoyed myself. And I do have a twinge of regret this year that we're not able to be in person, although it's very understandable. I think I miss in particular some of the excellent food that we've had in the past when I've been able to visit. And I grew up in Chicago, so it's home turf for me. But I do want to thank North Park for hosting this event. I want to express gratitude that we're able to do it this year, even online. And I want to thank you, Dr. Edwards, for all of your work for months now to put this into place. It's hard enough to know how to talk about a paper at a conference like this that you've already written when you're meeting in person. I think I've been challenged even further to think about the best way to approach my time, given that we are online in this kind of format. My paper is on Jeremiah 29, especially Jeremiah 29:7, a very well-known verse which talks about seeking the welfare of the city in this case being Babylon. And it seemed to me that the use of this scriptural text, particularly within contemporary political theology, really lent itself to further exploration at this conference, given the topic of this year, namely politics. There are 4 sections to my paper as I've written it, and those of you who have registered for the conference, you have access to the paper. I think what I'm going to do, and I hope that this will prove wise in retrospect, I'm going to try and summarize the first 3 sections, and then I'm going to read a part of the 4th section, really most of the 4th section. And in part that has to do with my assessment of what in the paper lends itself particularly to kind of oral delivery and oral presentation. So with that said, I will begin to summarize the sections of the paper. I will try and do this relatively briefly, but just sort of give you a sense of what I think the salient points are for these initial sections of the paper. In the introduction, the first section of the paper, really what I try and do is to sketch the terms of the question. And I suppose my interest here is in trying to point out that Jeremiah 29:7 is a text which is, of course, known within biblical studies and within theological scholarship. And in some way, it functions as a site at which both of these fields can sometimes talk to each other, although they don't always, regrettably. From the side of biblical studies, what I think I see going on with regard to this text is mostly a historical concern about what the original form of the text was, about what its originating circumstances were. I don't see in the literature, at least the literature that I've been able to review, the kind of attention within biblical studies to the contemporary use of this text that I think would be really important for biblical scholars to attend to. There's more and more attention to the history of reception, the history of biblical interpretation within biblical studies and other fields, and I feel like that's a very valuable direction for ongoing research. So again, in this introductory section, I try and show how I think, as a biblical scholar, I can say this. I think biblical scholars have kind of missed an opportunity to talk about this text in a fuller way. From the side of theology, especially political theology, what I'm trying to show in this initial section is that this has been a verse which has had a very kind of outsized role, really, in theological discussions, especially in contemporary discussions about political theology. My concern here is that I think it's almost developed an outsized importance within this kind of theological discussion. And, as a biblical scholar, I want to have some explanation for why we should privilege this text over other texts, especially over other texts that might not be as admiring or positive in the way foreign nations and cities like Babylon or Rome are perceived and are considered in the biblical witnesses. So I have a kind of worry about the use, although I'm glad that I'm always glad when theologians are concerned about the Bible. I'm always glad when theologians interpret the Bible, and I'm glad about that in this case. But I have questions, and it seems to me that the theological interpretation of Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah 29:7, can move in a couple of different directions. It can be used as a kind of warrant for a theology of liberation and social justice. I have at least one example where the text is used in the service of what we might call a sort of neoliberal capitalist, invest, make money, increase your wealth and the wealth of others. And so, even when this text is interpreted theologically, it is being used in different ways. And I worry here again that in part that may have to do with the extraction of this text from a historical context, from a literary exegetical context. And so given all of these different takes on the text, it seems to me important to go back and to do our exegesis, to do our close work with the text and see what we come up with. And that leads to the second section, where I really do the kind of nitpicky work that Bible scholars do when I look closely at the different forms of the text and the format of the text. A lot of prior scholarship in this regard has really been oriented towards the original form of the letter, the original contents of the letter. And what I try and point out in the second section is how more recent biblical scholarship has been attending more to the received form of the text. And this is a wider phenomenon in biblical studies. We've had what some people call a turn to the book, and that's been really significant for interpretation of the prophetic books of the Bible. It's, in my judgment, I don't really talk about this in the paper, but we could talk about this in the Q&A if people are interested. It's a kind of turn away from the more biographical approach to the prophetic books that really came to the fore at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and a more literary, book-oriented approach to the prophetic books, which I think came into place toward the end of the 20th century. And so it's, it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. But with regard to Jeremiah 29, the upshot is that rather than thinking so much about an original letter, what I see biblical scholars doing is trying to account for the present shape of the text. And they argue, and I argue here in this second section, that the text is organized in its present shape as really a series of prophetic messages or prophetic oracles. And you can see this from the prominent place of the prophetic speech formula, "Thus says the Lord," which really punctuates this account in Jeremiah 29, and there are other prophetic features. And that's also important because it ties Jeremiah 29 to the previous chapters of Jeremiah 27, 28, in which prophecy really seems to be the main motif and theme. How do we understand the prophetic witness in relation to Israel's exile and Israel's stay in Babylon? There are apparently some prophets who are saying that Israel will now go home. It's time. They have been punished enough for their sins, and the return is imminent. And Jeremiah famously disagrees and says from the Lord that more time in exile is needed. And that kind of theme then plays into Jeremiah 29, which is about how the stay in Babylon is going to be extended, and that's why the prophet tells the exiled people of Israel that they need to give themselves to the welfare of the city. And so in that, what we see is that the exile, Israel's presence in Babylon, really is, in the Jeremiah tradition, an expression of judgment. It's not being presented as an opportunity for mission, pure and simple. It's an expression of divine judgment. It is still time-bound or temporary. However, it's not a permanent move. The people of Israel are not going to be in Babylon forever. And in the third section of the paper, I dig into both of those points a little bit more by talking in particular about this famous verse in Jeremiah 29:7, seek the welfare of the city. And what I try and point out is how, in context, if we don't just read this verse in isolation, but if we read it in context, we see that although it is about seeking the welfare of the city, namely Babylon, the primary purpose here, the primary focus remains on Israel. Israel needs to do this because in this way, Israel still has something to learn about why the exile happened, about how they will need to think and pray and believe when they do eventually go back home. So this stay in Babylon is sketched as adjudicative. It's an education, right? And there's talk, of course, of multiplying. I mean, in this chapter, multiplying is really just as important as welfare seeking. So it's phrased reflexively. The reason that Israel is to seek the welfare of the city is, at least in part, if not first and foremost, so that Israel will survive, Israel will flourish, Israel will multiply, Israel will learn, and Israel will eventually be able to return. And that puts a different kind of spin on this text and the interpretation of this text, in my estimation, for political theology. And I'll just kind of crib a little bit from the end of this third section on my page 15, where I say, from this perspective, Jeremiah 29:7 is both less radical and more radical than many contemporary interpreters would have it. It's less radical because the exiles are not told to live in Babylon permanently, or to adopt Babylonian customs, or to seek being Jews. It's more radical because, unlike the situation of Christians in the modern West, the exiles were defeated captives without the rights of citizens outside their own land in the country of their military conquerors. Now, at this point, I'd like to turn to the fourth and final section of the paper and read some of my concluding reflections to you. So, does Jeremiah 29:7 have any relevance for contemporary discussions in political theology? Yes, I think so. Even though the main focus of the text, as I've argued exegetically, is on Israel's survival and spiritual well-being, the text perspective cannot be adequately described as utilitarian or self-interested. To the contrary, Jeremiah 29:7 does acknowledge what has been called a genuine interwovenness of welfare. That is, the emphasis is on Israel as God's elect people and chosen instrument, but there are accompanying convictions about God's universal sovereignty, the ultimate purpose of Israel's election as being the salvation, the repair of the entire world. For Jeremiah, his summoning of the people to genuine political participation was based on his confidence that all human societies, Gentile, like the Babylonians included, were under the reign of one and the same God, whether they knew this or not. God has a plan in place in this witness, this biblical witness, for Babylon too, Jeremiah 25:13-14, and all the peoples of the world, Jeremiah 25 again, 15-26. Even in times of imperial domination, therefore, there can still be constructive engagement by God's people in the structures of society, not for the sake of the empire, but for the sake of God's reign. This aspect of the biblical presentation is really encapsulated, I think, in the Hebrew verb seek, darash, in Jeremiah 29:7. Rather than some vague injunction, this Hebrew verb in this kind of context most likely introduces a technical phrase for cultic oracular activity. That is, seek the welfare literally means something like, and welfare here is peace, shalom. It literally means something like seek a peace oracle, a shalom oracle on behalf of the city. Now, that such oracular work could be done in Babylon apart and away from Jerusalem is already significant. But this kind of linguistic usage, this idea of seeking and getting an oracle, it articulates the text perspective quite precisely. It is still Israel's ongoing existence and worship life that counts first. But Israel's worship can and should be directed toward the flourishing of all human society. And this is paralleled in the text by the directive to pray to the Lord. And this close attention to language, I think, highlights how this text ironically becomes secularized in many theological discussions by being taken to refer to seeking and peace in general, in a kind of abstract way, perhaps exemplifying an attitude of neutral moral goodness. Put differently, what many proposals for political theology advocate today, I think, is an account of Christian theology without a doctrine of election. This is one of my key claims. And this is a problem from my perspective, because then Christian political action is either limited to individuals, it's just what good Christians do on their own, or some other group, especially the state, is invested with salvific agency. In the end, Jeremiah 29:7, I believe, warrants the view that the church's first responsibility, not its exclusive responsibility, but its primary one, is not to make society more just, but to become a just community. Now, in my judgment, the uses to which Jeremiah 29:7 is being put in contemporary political theology tend to underplay the corruptive dimension of politics and the state, as well as the missional witness of biblical faith. Political theologians are often reacting appropriately to the privatization of faith enforced within neoliberal politics on the one hand, and on the other, the bourgeois solipsism of many current faith communities. But I believe these theologians are insufficiently alert to the ways in which a focus on social engagement can undermine the church's attention to the vitality of its own tradition. And part of the reason may be that such theologians do not think they need to attend to the health of the church, especially if they're coming from an established church with cultural status, legal advantage, social privilege. But for those of us, like myself, coming from disestablished free churches, the vitality of the contemporary church is really an urgent concern. And I would certainly admit that even within established churches today, the situation really may be becoming more like that of the free churches with which I'm more familiar. Social justice is, of course, also an urgent concern. But for me, and this is a key question, for me, the prior question is, how will Christian advocates for social justice be formed? Where do they come from? The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not spring into action fully formed, like Athena from Zeus's forehead. Nor did King discover social justice in a book or a university syllabus. He was raised in a preacher's family with two devout Christian parents, and he grew to maturity within the faith community of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Although it remains somewhat little known, his given name was actually Michael Luther King, like his father, but his father took to calling himself Martin Luther King, particularly after he participated in the 1934 Baptist World Congress in Berlin, Germany. And he had an opportunity to encounter the Reformation legacy of Martin Luther more closely. So both he and his son gradually became known as Martin Luther King, Sr. and Jr., although among some close associates, they remained known as Big Mike and Little Mike. The point is that Martin Luther King Jr.'s own name is a tradition-bound construct signaling his deep embeddedness within a web of historical social relations, the Christian tradition, and yes, the church. If theologians do not attend to the question of Christian formation, even the most winsome account of political theology will find itself without any takers. Where will we discover the people who actually want to be both theological and political, who will possess the Christian virtues and character necessary for constructive, transformative political activity and advocacy within wider society, especially at the cost of suffering and possible loss of life? Without this kind of formation, Christians will only replicate the cultural mindset and political manners of current society. And the question is not whether people will be formed, but how they will be formed and according to what pattern. Because the Bible's prophetic tradition is so often invoked as a warrant for social action, it is important to observe that the biblical prophets not only critique injustice, but strive to create greater justice through rehabilitated social practices and institutions. There's thus a danger, it seems to me, in focusing on performative uses of Scripture to the exclusion of formative uses of Scripture. Scripture not only instructs Christians in how to live out their faith, it inspires them and instructs them in how to become Christians and be part of the people of God. The Constantinian temptation lingers on, both wittingly and unwittingly, then, in some proposals for political theology, both liberal and conservative. Both camps reach first for action by the state and changes in federal policy. But the biblical vision is different, I would suggest, and no less political, although, yes, more sectarian. True, a fully sectarian ecclesiology is not a viable possibility, since for the Bible, withdrawal from the world remains an abdication of responsibility. Yes. What the Bible instead promotes, I am persuaded, is the construction and maintenance of a contrast community that will instruct and inspire wider society by the beauty and surpassing justice of its example, even as it strategically engages that society in order to provide a living witness to God and God's purposes in the world. In other words, the Bible's political program is God's people, Israel. For Christians, this is the task and mission of the church as the new Israel. As Jacques Ellul famously challenged his fellow Christians, how can we be the question that God puts to the world? The task of the church is not only to do something, but to be something. Viewed comprehensively, the somewhat differing perspectives on the Babylonian exile can be found within the Bible, but they ultimately all view the exile as something negative. And even though the exilic event concludes with the return of some Judeans to Yehud and the reestablishment of the Judean community and its institutions, there emerges, quite interestingly, in the post-exilic biblical writings, a somewhat unexpected, I think, ongoing typology of exile. And so in Ezra 9, in a prayer before the returned community in Jerusalem, Ezra surprisingly declares, "We are slaves," even as he thanks God for extending steadfast love before the kings of Persia to give us new life. Ezra 9:9. It seems then that Israel's return has not entirely ended its oppression. Likewise, in Nehemiah 9, Ezra prays to God, "Here we are, slaves to this day, slaves in the land that you gave to our ancestors." The return then has not fully resolved Israel's political situation, with the result that post-exilic Judeans remain like slaves or exiles, only now in their own land. And this extended sense of exile is also on display in Daniel 9, in which Jeremiah's predicted 70 years of exile are actually lengthened to 70 weeks of years. Now, from this vantage point, Jeremiah's injunction to seek the welfare of the city can be viewed as counsel extending beyond its immediate circumstances. If exile persists in some fashion, then seeking the welfare of the exilic host culture can and needs to persist as well. In the Old Testament's post-exilic literature, however, the primary force of that counsel is directed towards Israel's well-being within the context of an Israel restored to its land, but nonetheless subsisting as a disempowered minority under foreign domination. Remarkably, an exilic sensibility also continues into the New Testament. And so the letter of James, directed to Christians, is addressed to the 12 tribes of the dispersion, James 1:1. The letter of 1 Peter is similarly addressed to the exiles of the dispersion, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood, 1 Peter 1:1. With such formulations, early Christians are acknowledged to retain an exilic identity, and this identity becomes a canonical one. The Christian Bible as a whole, then, I would argue, is strongly exilic in its overall orientation and thrust, and a typology of exile frames the Bible's understanding of political action on the part of the people of God. The writer of 1 Peter goes on to develop this point of view, drawing on Jeremiah's legacy. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh and to wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that, though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. 1 Peter 2:11-12. Crucially, this idea of conducting oneself honorably, with its evident concern about wider society, is not offered as a strategy for winning social approval, but as a means of encouraging non-Christians to come to know God. And there's direct line right to the Sermon on the Mount at this point. City on a hill, right? I think some of the most inspiring words and one of the clearest expressions of this kind of viewpoint that I've been trying to paint is found in the 2nd century letter of Diagnetis. And I will close with the words of this letter, which I think give us a vision of the kind of Christian community which is being imagined and endorsed in these early New Testament letters, and also the kind of view of the people of God that goes back to the Old Testament and right back to the book of Jeremiah. So the letter goes, Christians are distinguished from others, neither by country nor language, nor the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. But inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as foreigners. Every foreign land to them is as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. It goes on. I won't read the rest. If you've got the paper, you can read the rest of what I find to be very inspiring words. What I think, from my perspective, is both so striking and sobering about this ancient description of Christian community is how distinctive that community was once imagined to be, so that the truth and power of its beliefs would come from the character of its example. Thanks very much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chapman. That was fantastic. I'm going to turn it over right now to Dr. Michelle Clifton-Soderstrom.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, and also Dr. Chapman. I love the quote, the Diagnetis quote at the end of your paper. I think it really well encapsulates what you did. So I'm glad that you did read that. And I also, as I said to you in email, felt really welcomed into your scholarly work as a theologian. You were very generous with theologians, so I appreciated that. And I liked some of the images that you used throughout your paper. And of course, your challenge of the assumption that the New Testament always trumps the Old Testament. I'm a fan of the Old Testament too. So I'd like to make two extended comments about seeking the welfare of the city in the larger context of chapter 29 and the book of Jeremiah as well. One has to do with theological interpretation, and the other has to do with the content of seeking the welfare of the city. And my aim is to amplify how hope functions in this text and its application. And in that vein, I'll add a closing comment and actually a prayer on how a woman in Jeremiah, namely Rachel, contributes significantly to his prophetic voice. So first, the theological interpretation of scripture. You offer at the beginning a really apt critique that biblical scholars often privilege the early and original and concern themselves with the world behind the text. And that on the other hand, theologians appropriate seeking the welfare of the city without historical moorings. And when you said this, I'm reminded of a Brueggemann quote where he says, "The prophetic word is not a proposition or an announcement of set truths. It is often the playful exploration and processing of insight that is not known until it is brought to precisely the right shape of expression." And as a theologian, a moral theologian who is really comfortable with a lot of room for grayness, for ambiguity, for the text to take shape in the life of the people, I love this quote. It's very eschatological. And I think the eschatological framework is precisely the interpretive piece that helps avert these dual temptations that you note between biblical scholars and theologians. And moreover, I think it has the promise of keeping us accountable to the hermeneutical importance of keeping the world behind the text tethered to the world in the text. And I'll add, as a moral theologian, as it informs a moral logic that allows us to live the text in the world. So by eschatological lens, I'm referring, of course, to a theology of history that can inform interpretation. And by eschatological, this is not exhaustive, but I mean a few things, especially as it pertains to the book of Jeremiah and the text that you're focusing on. First, the attention to the now, in this case, his vivid descriptions of Israel in exile, and the not yet, which is the hope, right, that will come in 70 years with the return to the land and ultimately the fullness of time. Secondly, an eschatological lens acknowledges that we are an Advent people living in the present and awaiting God's good future. What Christ has set in motion continues to be subject to Christ's return or second coming. And this life and all of history is connected to the next. And this is related to my third point, which is the assumption that I have that liberation happens in history. It's a reality that I think the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ confirm. And so when I say the fullness of time, it's the fullness of history. And this matters deeply for our justice work as it pertains to seeking the welfare of the city. Two more points about the eschatological framework. And that is when I teach on migration and immigration, I'm always struck by how very close the immigrant migrant identity is to the doctrine of eschatology. People leaving home, seeking home, moving vulnerably in the world. And I think that is very apropos when we're talking about the people in exile in the book of Jeremiah. And then finally, of course, eschatology is ultimately a doctrine of hope. And this is the ironic impact, right, of Jeremiah's despair. He is arguably the person who suffers most and hopes most in the Old Testament. And in doing so, he's embodying the hope of Judah and the inauguration of the new Israel. So I think an eschatological framework for interpreting can pull in theologians and biblical scholars at their best. I think it allows the text and its worlds to move behind, within, and in us in a way that reminds Christians, as you say, Dr. Chapman, that our canonical identity is an exilic one. These eschatological themes inform the living text in ways that keep us alert. I love this phrase that you have, to the vitality of the church's own tradition as we read and apply its insights and expressions. And finally, the lens of eschatology and the inauguration, but awaiting for the fullness, right, of time, is a model of communication between the text and our reflections on God, or alternatively between the field of biblical studies and theological ethics. So that's my first comment. Secondly, I want to connect seeking the welfare of the city with the work of social justice in a way that honors Jeremiah's prophetic reach and remains attentive to your, Dr. Chapman's, critique that even the most winsome accounts of political theology or social engagement will not succeed if we don't attend to Christian formation. I think that's a really important point. Formation is key. I can attest to this in my own life. I think some people do the work of social justice because it's a matter of survival, and others do it because they have a deep love and passion for people. God has placed a burden, to use the language of my Pentecostal brothers and sisters, on them, and they have said yes to God's call. And I find myself in the latter category. I'm not doing it as a matter of survival. And many people who are part of this conference know that my particular burden is prison abolition as it connects to education for persons who are incarcerated in Illinois. And I have to ask this question all the time: how is this work sustainable? Not just for me, but my partners who with whom I collaborate and work with. Going into a prison on a regular basis taxes my entire body and my soul and my psyche and my spirit. And despair is this close every time I walk in and out of there. It's exhausting, and we come up against powers and principalities on a regular basis. And as you can imagine, the evil is real. So I'm no Jeremiah, but I understand and I appreciate his despair. And when I think of the kind of formation that you are discussing, Dr. Chapman, I think of Jeremiah and the way hope sustains him in the midst of his anguish. Walter Brueggemann rightly argues that Jeremiah's hope is not grounded in the present. It's not anchored in his sense that we are progressing towards something better, or even that we are evolving in the right direction. And it's precisely because of this that hope is not undone when things don't get better, right? And so Jeremiah's hope, as we see in his prophetic posture, is birthed in two things. One, he calls things as he sees them. He has concrete descriptions of what's happening in Judah with the exilic identity, with false prophets and empty incantations, all of it. His descriptions are not abstract and they're not obtuse. He belongs to a particular time and place, and his treatment of the political situation is specific and vivid. The second piece that his hope is birthed in is the fact that he is intimately familiar with Yahweh's despair. In fact, so intimate that they are intertwined at points. You're wondering, right, who is speaking? And when he is articulating his despair, you can see that he is almost immobilized by grief, but yet he's so aware of it. He's aware of the pain, protest, even rage of Yahweh, that he is able to see more clearly, right, or clearly, how God can create a future out of a hopeless present, a good future. Quick diversion. When I was in prison the other day, I was monitoring a Zoom class for one of our homiletics professors, and I was struck. And we've just gotten in after COVID. We've been out for over a year, and we've started coming in over the summer. And the trauma that COVID added on top of the trauma of being incarcerated, you just feel it. And I was sitting there in class, and the students looked tired. And then at one moment, the professor said, you're going to be preaching on Ephesians. Does anyone have any questions? And one person said, how long does it have to be? And the next person said, how many sources do we have to use? And the third person raises his hand and says, Professor Sutton, I'm going to need an organ. And when he said that, the room lifted, and the laughter and the joy that penetrated, the hope, right? This place of despair, and this happens all the time. I feel like there's a real understanding of how hope is working, even when we don't see liberation in the ways that we want to see it. And that's because it's deeply tied to the emotions or the response of God that we see clearly in Jeremiah. So I think this is the work for us, the work of our social engagement, justice, seeking the welfare of the city, Jeremiah's connection with despair and the related emotions that come with that of disappointment as the crucible for hope is both terrifying and inspiring all at once. And deep down, Dr. Chapman, I know this is what you mean when you're calling for our social engagement and justice to be patterned after the prophetic word, not just performative, but formative. So I'll end my remarks by gesturing toward the much anticipated hope in Jeremiah 31 and the promise of restoration. I find Rachel's contribution here to be a powerful eschatological horizon within which we seek the welfare of the city. She is deeply also, like Jeremiah, emotionally connected with restoration, the restoration of Israel as a broken, sinful nation. So many of the biblical men wrestle with God in life, and she does so in death. And her suffering is in classic Jeremiah form. Her posthumous tears span from Genesis into Jeremiah 31, all the way into the Gospel of Matthew. And so I'm going to read the words from Jeremiah 31 as we imagine Rachel's affect as it's depicted in chapter 31. Thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. And I'll end in concert with a prayer that I think is in concert with her demanding tears. These are mystical words of an apocalyptic Jewish prayer. They paint a sublime picture of her anticipated consolation. And their prayer, this prayer that I'm about to read, names one of the first acts by the crowned Messiah. Where shall this be? On the way to Ephrat, at the crossroads, which is Rachel's grave. To Mother Rachel, he will bring glad tidings, and he will comfort her. And now she will let herself be comforted, and she will rise up and kiss him. Jeremiah is clear. The exile will be long and painful as of a woman in travail. Therefore, seek the welfare of the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clifton-Soderstrom. I wish you both could hear the applause, because we're grateful for both your presentations. Some questions have come in, but before we get to them, Dr. Chapman, did you want to have an initial response back to Dr. Clifton-Soderstrom? I don't know if you wanted to make any comment.
There I am. Just a couple of very brief thoughts. I'm really grateful for the response. And I think what I'm especially grateful for is that you've seen how I'm trying to articulate a perspective that is a both and perspective. I think I could be heard as saying, piety is more important than social action or something like that. And that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm wanting to say. I'm trying to talk about how we do both together and in combination. So I thank you for that. I will admit to having just a slight hesitancy about eschatology. And I think it has to do with the fact that I'm an Old Testament scholar. And sometimes I'm aware that kind of perspective, the apocalyptic perspective, where it's all about what is new, has actually been used against the Old Testament altogether. And I would want, one of the things that is quite intriguing to me is how in the Old Testament and the New, whether we're looking at Isaiah or we're looking at Revelation, the future is imagined in terms of the past, right? And it's really new. And at the same time, there are some things that we've seen before. And even within Jeremiah, I think of the verses in Jeremiah 6, Jeremiah 31 about seeking the ancient ways, the ancient monuments. So, I'd want to hold out for a kind of grounding in the past and a tradition. And Jesus did not return in the first couple of generations, right? As some of the New Testament writers apparently expected. And that opens up a new set of questions. And precisely because of that, some of the Old Testament texts may be of real value for further Christian reflection and use. So I absolutely affirm what you're saying about an eschatological understanding and direction, but I just have a twinge, I just have a little hesitancy. And at the same time, I want to completely affirm your wanting to connect what I'm doing in 29 with the little book of comfort in Jeremiah 30 through 33. That seems exactly right to me. And if I were going to develop this further, that's where I would go. It seems to me the section in Jeremiah, of which Jeremiah 29 is a part, about true and false prophecy, leads right into that next set of chapters. And I like what you said about them, and I would want to kind of move in that direction. I would just close by saying, I think, the perspective I'm trying to articulate is a perspective in which Christian communities need to be more intentional, more distinctive, more imaginative, and more generous, right? And that's another way of trying to get at the sort of vision for Christian community that I think I'm trying to articulate in the paper. But thank you so much for those very thoughtful and discerning comments. I really appreciate them. You've given me some things to think about.
Thank you both. Some questions have come in, and I want to encourage folks who are listening, if you're still formulating, please do. I won't cut off time prematurely. So if you've got some questions or comments, please. First off, Nathaniel, he says, first off, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. You put to words and concrete thoughts what has been ethereally murky, but present in my own thought processes regarding this topic. Question: in regards to performative versus formative uses of scripture, do you think churches should seek to have multiple homegrown faith-based programs for their congregants to plug into via the church by which to seek the welfare of the city? Or should a church seek to build congregants, forming them to be the type of people who then seek the welfare of the city, regardless of programs available to them, faith-based or otherwise?
Yep. This is an excellent question. This, in a way, is my own question. After I finished the paper and sent it off, and I thought about it some more, my own worry, if I were responding to my own paper, my worry is that by distinguishing in the way that I have between the performative and the formative, that I have unintentionally reinforced the divide. And I think the next step would be to think even more concretely about how these two things might work hand in hand. That is it not the case that some work of justice needs to be a part of how Christians are formed? And I think this is exactly the kind of thing that Nathaniel is asking, and rightly so. And I would want to affirm that. But what that also does is to open up all kinds of questions about how, right? And our works of justice, when they're done, are they really a part of Christian formation? Or are they somehow distanced or different or extra or something else? And I need to think about this more, but I'll give you one small, brief, concrete example. I had the wonderful opportunity to go and teach for a couple of weeks in the Methodist Seminary in South Africa several years ago. And I was able to visit churches, and I visited with a Methodist pastor who pastored a church in a kind of urban church in South Africa. And I was just talking with him about what the church was like and what they did. And he was telling me that the church supported all kinds of ministries in the city. And he looked at me at one point and he said, "But we never put a check in the mail." I said, "What do you mean you never put a check in the mail? What are you talking about?" He said, "We have a rule in our church that we never mail a check. We support all kinds of ministries financially, but somebody from the church always has to go. We want members of the church to be on site in these ministries and these social service agencies. We want them to be aware of what they're doing. We want them." And so that's just a small example, but it seems to me a very creative, interesting way in which the church is really trying to make the work of social justice part of Christian formation and part of the life of the church. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to happen a lot more.
Thank you for your pastoral sensitivity. I think that a couple other questions are in a similar vein. Kate asks, "Thank you for your thoughts. On page 17, you state Jeremiah 29:7 warrants the view that the church's first responsibility is not to make society more just, but to become a just community." Then on page 19, the idea of Christian formation is mentioned, and then you have a closing comment that conducting oneself honorably with evident concern about wider society is a means of encouraging non-Christians to come to know God. So I wonder what your thoughts are regarding a connection between how the Israelites became this obedient and just community and what practices could be implemented today to become a just community that encourages non-Christians to come to know God.
Yeah. Another really good question. I mean, my own view is I think we need to be much more concerned as Christians and Christian communities about how we are perceived in wider society. Look at Paul's concern for how non-Christians are regarding Christian worship, and that it's a real problem if Christian worship is confusing or problematic for outsiders when they observe this. It's hard for me not to feel like the Christian church has really given itself a number of black eyes in recent years. And isn't that a kind of squandering of our witness? I mean, to the extent that we want there to be a Christian witness to the world, I think we have to really be concerned about our credibility. And I think in some cases, our credibility has been damaged quite deeply. And I have a kind of, as a biblical scholar, as a theologian, I have a very healthy regard for sin. And it seems to me too easy sometimes for us as Christians to automatically point the finger at some kind of federal law, without taking a hard look at ourselves in the mirror. Should we not look at the beam in our own eye before we start looking at the mote in someone else's? Do we really have the kind of authority to speak on some moral issues if our community and our life together looks immoral and unjust? I think sometimes we really need to pose some of these questions to ourselves before we pose them anywhere else. That would be a sort of more critical contribution in response to the question. But right on. I mean, I think the question is moving in a really good direction. That would just be part of a response to it.
Thank you.
Dr. Edwards, can I add something? So that sentence that I think it was Kate put up stood out to me first. In fact, I tweeted it. It's probably my fourth tweet I just started. And but then I started thinking about it. And when I talked about people who do justice as a matter of survival and people who do justice because I mean, that to me feels like if we were in a room full of people, I would say people who feel like justice is more a matter of survival, please respond to this, because that bifurcation feels like one that comes out of a place of option.
Yeah. I hear that.
Yeah. There's a few more, and I want to get them in if we can. Carrie asks, seeking the welfare of the city can quickly move into utilitarianism, doing work for the welfare of the majority of the city. Can you speak towards perhaps a working towards welfare of the city that may be costly to some members, sometimes a majority of the members of the community, in order to increase the welfare of even just one?
It's a great question. I'll respond to it briefly in light of the time, and that does not reflect the question's importance. But I would just say in response that, of course, what is crucial here is what we mean by welfare or prosperity or flourishing. And we have to be very careful that we don't quickly substitute these very theologically rich terms in the biblical discourse for some kind of thin, neutral, contemporary social understanding. And I think this is the force of the language of utilitarianism in the question. I mean, it's got to be a theological understanding of welfare or peace, shalom. That's a very rich theological word, and yet that word is sometimes used in very reduced, thin ways. The classic example, thinking of Dr. King again, would be peace just as the absence of violence, right? Rather than the presence of justice. And so we need to be very careful that we approach even words like this in a kind of theologically discerning manner.
Thank you. I have a couple more at least. Frederick asks, thank you for your presentation and raising questions for us to consider with this particular text. In regards to the church's primary responsibility, when distinguishing the primary responsibility of the church, does the pursuit to make society more just focus on the reorientation of the state, where making a just community centers our attention on the transformation of people within our understanding of human dignity and communal flourishing? I think you're getting the gist of that question. You're seeing it there. It sounds like there's the question of what's primary.
Yeah, and that would be worthy of a longer conversation. I'm not necessarily sure that my language of that is best. What I was trying to do again is to get at this dimension of formation, and sort of at least primary in that sense, that we have to attend at the same time that we attend to the work of justice, we have to attend to the work of forming Christians who will be advocates for justice. And as somebody in theological education, somebody who's spent a good bit of energy on doctoral education, even though it's another kind of step at a remove, I'm very concerned about where pastors and teachers of the future come from and their role in helping to form people, helping to form Christians as well. That's part of my own commitment to theological education. It can seem very intangible, indirect work sometimes, but it seems to me all quite important. So I don't want to make too much of the primary. I mean, again, I'm really trying to articulate a both and perspective, and not an either or. But it does seem to me, especially in some contemporary political theology, that the formational aspect of all this is unwittingly or sometimes wittingly rejected or left behind. And that's where I think some of my argument is intentionally a little more polemical. I'm trying to say, if you're going to undermine what you want to do if you don't attend to this other aspect of ecclesial existence.
Thank you. Dr. Michelle, were you going to jump in there? No? Okay, I've got at least a couple more. Rianne, I hope is the correct pronunciation. Thank you very much, Dr. Chapman and Dr. Clifton-Soderstrom. In the context of Jeremiah 29, how does liberation theology intersect with the land/cohabitation. In this passage, Dr. Chapman describes the coexistence of Israel and Babylon during the exile, and even that their coexistence can bring mutual prosperity. At times, liberation theology can look at power structures as a means of reconciling two groups at odds. However, I believe what I hear in your paper seeks a different means of reconciliation through Israel's cohabitation with Babylon and mutual prosperity, which seems to change the reconciliatory model of liberation theologies. If I've understood your paper, how does this challenge of cohabitation and the land intersect with liberation theologies?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also worthy of more extended discussion and on my part, more reflection. But if I've gotten it correctly, I think what the question is driving at is this sense that sometimes when we think about liberation theology and the work of social justice, there's a kind of againstness in the foreground. There's kind of over againstness. And I think it would be interesting to think, especially in light of Jeremiah 29, about how sometimes the work of liberation, the work of social justice, might need to be also a work of for and with, and not only against. So, for example,
Dr. Chapman, you froze up over here. Okay. I had wondered if we were going to have any technical issues. We were doing so well. Let's see. Hopefully he'll be back pretty soon. All right.
I'm not sure where he was going with that though, but I would take issue with the idea that maybe he didn't mean this and he's frozen, so maybe I shouldn't that liberation theology would be something against and not for, that it would be working against.
Yeah, I think the next question kind of could connect in the sense that the mention of Exodus comes up. Nick asked a question about exilic identity and the book of Exodus, which in my mind connects to some liberation thinking. But hopefully Dr. Chapman will be able to log back on. I don't have his phone number handy. Do you have can you contact him quickly to see if he can re-engage? He might be trying to do that anyway. And thank you all who are attending these sessions, and really with some rich questions. We're going to stop around 6, but we'll see if Dr. Chapman gets back, if we can hear from him again before we take a break. We put a fairly robust dinner break in there. At the time, thinking that we might have a watch party on campus, but that's not happening. But even still, we'll be back together at 7:30 Central Time, and to hear another paper and response, and really hope that you can come back and join us then. I'm going to hang on here, hoping that Dr. Chapman makes it back before 6.
Dennis, while we're waiting, I see Nick Pringle's question on there, and I think I could answer for Dr. Chapman.
Oh, yeah, you know what? Let me go ahead and say his question. And Nick says, you mentioned early Christians are acknowledged to retain an exilic identity, and this identity becomes a canonical one. While not reading into this text, but into the biblical canon, how does the Exodus help inform the conversation of the exile?
I mean, I think he would, I mean, he didn't obviously treat that, but he does talk a lot about the importance of the exilic identity in general. He says it's a canonical one, and he I don't think he went through this when he read his paper tonight, but the typology of the exile, he says, frames the whole Bible's understanding of the political action on the part of God's people. And then he said it goes all the way into 1 Peter, of course, which is your area, Dr. Edwards, right?
Yeah. Well, I had some thoughts about that because he says, Dr. Chapman, if he won't make it back, I don't think, but he says on page 12 that one of his primary goals is to show that the exile in Jeremiah 29, it primarily is punishment and not an opportunity for mission. So primarily is punishment. There's a scholar, Shively Smith, she's written on First Peter, and she makes a case that the diaspora identity that you see in James and First Peter, but she focuses on First Peter, is not punishment, but this alienation is due to injustice, oppression. So I did want to ask that question. It's something I would want to explore. While I think that stranger motif is throughout the Bible, the foreigner, alien, the stranger, I see it differently working in First Peter, in that the faith community is not exiled out of punishment. They are alien and stranger because society is rejecting them. So I think that that's different than what's happening in the Old Testament. But I have heard a lot of people say the church is in exile, and I rather would say the church is in diaspora. But there are perhaps elements of the church that might be in exile if there's a punishment aspect to it. So yeah, but I do think that standing outside is certainly travels throughout. Well, I think we'll go ahead and make our break now. Thank you so much, everyone that's joined, and I hope that you will come back after dinner. 7:30 Central Time. We'll start right away, and it'll be another stimulating time. And then to remind you that tomorrow we start Friday morning at 8:45 in the morning Central Time, and there will be papers in the morning, and then lunch break, and then papers that will end before the dinner hour. So we hope that you can join us tomorrow as well as later this evening. Thank you.